Okay, it's my pleasure as Chair of the Faculty of Economics to welcome you to the 12th Stone Lecture, which is held annually in honour of Sir Richard Stone, who is an eminent Cambridge economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1984 for his work developing the methodology for national income accounting that is used around the world. It's my pleasure to introduce the Stone Lecturer for this evening, Professor Oriana Bandiera. Professor Bandiera is the Sir Anthony Atkinson Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. She is an honorary foreign member of the American Economic Association, a fellow of the British Academy and of the Econometric Society, where she is currently the co-editor of the journal Econometric, and been suffering through all of that. She is also director of the Hub for Equal Representation at the LSE and of the Gender Growth and Labour Markets in Low-Income Countries program at IZA. She serves on the Council of the Econometric Society and was past president of the European Economic Association. For her pioneering research, Professor Bandiera has been awarded the R. Joe Janssen Prize in 2019 for the top European economist under 45. She also received the Carlo Alberto Medal in 2011 for the top Italian economist under 40. And in 2021 was awarded an honorary doctorate in economics from the University of Munich. Professor Bandiera's research combines economic theory, policy, and practice, and has enhanced our understanding of what drives managerial and worker behavior and how that affects productivity and inequality. Her work is absolutely fundamental in shaping how we understand the nature of organizations, labour markets and economic activity in poor countries today. It is therefore with great pleasure that we warmly welcome to Cambridge Oriana and invite her to give this year's Stone's lecture on the organisation of labour and economic development.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So that's the title. And you've been reading this for a while. There are two sides of economics development, depending on whether you ask the micro people or the macro people. We either look at individuals or we look at countries, right? And both of them raise very interesting questions. Now, the point of this lecture is to bring these two things together, show that they're not two separate, like in physics, where you have the quantum mechanics and the other one, which now I can't remember what it's called. But the two things are basically two sides of exactly the same coin. And what brings them together is organizations, and in particular, organizations and how labor is organized. Why labor? Well, because if we start at the very bottom, labor is the only endowment of the poor. But it's also the main factor of production in all economies. There is a lot of talk about the allocation of capital and the misallocation of capital, but at most, capital accounts for 1/3 of national income. So understanding whether labor is employed efficiently is key both to understand poverty at the micro level, difference in national income at the macro level, and I would argue the link between the two, but not how you know it. In the sense that normally when we link macro and micro, we say that we need growth to reduce poverty. So the macro comes first, there is growth, and then everybody will benefit. What I think this research shows is that you have to eliminate poverty to have growth, so that the link goes the other way. The idea is not exactly new. I think the first book in economics spoke exactly about this. Actually, the first paragraph of the first chapter of the first book in economics talked about this. So I can't claim that this is a new idea. But what I'm bringing that is new is new data and new problems that have emerged in the last 300 years or so. Okay, I cannot list all my co-authors because there are many and all fabulous, but I will talk roughly about these, how many are there? 6 papers, today 7 papers, and they are co-authored with very fantastic and very, very patient co-authors because they have to deal with me on a regular basis. And I will start there are some key themes that will thread together all these different papers. And the key themes are poverty traps and other forms of multiple equilibria, complementarities as a source of multiple equilibria, and hence the need for cooperation. I've been talking a lot this afternoon with students here in Cambridge about methods, about field experiments, because I've done lots of field experiments on RCTs. So all this research is actually driven by the question rather than the method. So I won't have time to go into the exact details of each paper, but you will see a bit of everything, from RCTs to structural estimation of macro models. So let me start by setting the scene. And the scene is set by these two papers. The one at the bottom is the one that started my interest in this topic. And the one at the top is the paper that basically provides the entire framework for the lecture. Now, this list contains 101 possible jobs. This is the list that myself and the researchers at BRAC, the NGO BRAC in Dhaka, put together when we were forming the survey to evaluate BRAC's Targeting the Ultra-Poor program. Also known as the graduation program, this is one of the most ambitious poverty reduction programs ever implemented. It's very successful. I can tell you the end of the story. There's no suspense there. And the evaluation was done at great scale. So in order to do that with the survey, the program aimed to reduce poverty by giving jobs to poor women. So we needed to know which jobs the women were doing before. And for this reason, we made this list of 102 possible jobs that poor women can do in villages in rural Bangladesh. Then we collected the data, and we found out that there were 3 jobs that the women were doing. 3 out of the 100 that we thought were feasible. Okay? So here the color coding is the 3 main jobs that women do. This is livestock rearing, if they can afford livestock, or a form of casual labor. Casual labor is labor without a contract, is daily employment depending on availability. And they can do casual labor either as domestic servants or in agriculture. Now, the graphs on the left is actually coding by a geographical branch, by geographical area. And you see that the red and the blue are substitutes. So there are areas where they do only domestic maid work and areas in which they do only casual labor in agriculture. So effectively, the casual labor is only one type. And they can do livestock rearing only if they have livestock, which by definition, being poor, means that they don't have livestock. So effectively, all the women were doing 1 out of the 100 jobs that we listed. So that is the curse of applied micro, that you go into detail of one setting and you have no idea how common that is. So is it weird that in these villages, women were only doing 1 job, and that's why perhaps the program worked, and it will not work anywhere else, because it's this strange case in which there's only 1 job available. You give them a second job, that makes massive difference. If there were 100 jobs, maybe the 101st job would not make a difference. So the biggest challenge that we face when we do all sorts of research, but especially development research, is trying not to see the world through the lens of our own world, where there are a multitude of jobs. And that's what drove us to write that long list. Okay. Because of this project, I started thinking that we should know more about jobs at the aggregate level using microdata, so that the next person who's going to write a long survey, having 100 possible jobs and finding that there are 2 and actually 1, can look at the data and see how common this is. And so I embarked, thanks to FCDO, who founded this project, and IZA, that allowed me to do it. I embarked in this operation of harmonizing census data for all the countries that I could find, from the DHS, Demographic and Health Service, and ICONS. We now cover 115 countries, and we have microdata which can be aggregated at the country level, but also at the country gender level, at the country age group level, anything you want, and importantly, at the wealth level. And you can download those data from there. Now, this is the world coverage of the data. And you see the light blue is DHS, and the dark blue is IPONS. The cool thing about this, if you look at national account data, which I guess is compulsory to come to this lecture, is that we cover everywhere. Normally, when we put census data together, all of Africa and India are left out because we don't have census data for those countries. But the DHS asks many of the same questions and is equally representative. And so we can merge it by cohort. And that gives us pretty much a world covered. Right. So we have to start by defining work if we want to describe work. In theory, work is any activity that creates value and that can be done by others. So there's very few things that are not work. Sleep is not work. I would like to pay you to sleep on my behalf, but unfortunately, that's not feasible still yet. In practice, that's not how work is coded in the national accounts. The national accounts count any production activity, regardless of whether it's for sale or for own consumption. And that creates a lot of inconsistencies. Now, I'm not going to do anything about this, but I'm just have to warn you that we use the standard definition. And the standard definition in particular tends to call work things that are done in the market, but not things that are done at home. So that tends to underestimate women's contribution. That's all I'm going to say. I'm just going to use work as measured work in the standard system of national accounts sense. Now, having given it the definition, what we document in the paper, and what we can document with this data, is that there are three transformations in the organization of labor. Okay? The first is the marketization of work. So if you start in the poorest areas or at the poorest time in richer countries today, most people were at subsistence level and most people were producing what they needed for consumption. So the first step in changing the organization of work is going to the market. The second step is the emergence of firms and the prevalence of wage work. And then the third step is the fractionalization of work into specialized occupations. Now, this movement from self-employment, so having your own little business selling stuff on the market, which is the prevalent means of organization of work in the poorest countries today, and what we normally intend as work, that is, you go to the office and you get a wage, is really the main feature of the transformation of labor. It happens at the same time as the better known things like structural transformation, move away from agriculture, but it happens within each sector. So this is the beginning. And you see here, this is data from the entire world, where each country is, the data is put together from the microdata. And the bottom line is unpaid work, which is subsistence work, that goes down. The top line is paid work, that goes up. Right? Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is what generates the U-shape in women's labor force participation. That is quite well known. So here is split between men and women. And you see that for women, the decrease in unpaid work starts very steep, and the increase in market work is weaker, So the two combined create this U shape. Now, once you move from subsistence to market, inequality starts appearing. So this is what you can do with microdata once you have like really the individual data. What we do here is that we split people, always at the country level, by wealth quintiles. So each of these lines represent a different quintile. So if you look at the pool graph, the one that looks the color of a whale here, in this graph here, can't see, okay, with the one that says pool, the thicker line, the darker line, is the wealthiest people in the country. And on the vertical axis, you have labor force participation. So that is flat for the top quintile, which means that doesn't change with GDP. Whereas poorer people in poorer countries work more, and then they go down. Okay? Men always have a higher level of representation than women in the labor force, but you see that the link with wealth is always the same. So over the course of development, the top quintile of wealth remains the same, and the participation rate of the poorest people goes down. Now, what changes mostly is the movement from self-employment to wage work. In low-income economies, around 10% of workers are in wage work, which makes concepts such as unemployment kind of odd to use. To say that the unemployment of Niger is 20% means nothing because there are no jobs. Unemployment is defined as wanting to work at the going wage rate and not being able to find a job. When there are no jobs, it makes no sense to talk about unemployment. And the distribution of wage work across countries is heavily bimodal. That is, there are very few economies that have 50% of people employed in wage jobs. You either have everybody with a wage job or everybody self-employed. And this is the evolution of self-employment and wage work as a function of GDP. And as I was mentioning earlier, this is not driven by structural transformation. It happens in every sector. Right? Here we split between agriculture and the other sectors, and you see that in every sector there is this change. So it's an organizational change rather than a structural change. It just happens at the same time. And by wealth and gender, you see that it is the poorest people who are the last to get the wage jobs. The richest people get them first. And typically the richest men will get the first wage jobs, followed by the poorer men, followed by women. Now, we have gone from subsistence to market. In markets, you have many self-employed, and then from the self-employment into wage work. It's not over, because as development progresses, what we have is the rise of jobs in the sense of the number of jobs increase. And we document this here. This is the number of available jobs. On the left-hand side panel, you have a time series. So if you take the ISCO codes, which are used everywhere to code different occupations, there are many more type of jobs in rich countries than in poorer countries. And likewise, there are many more jobs today in, say, the US or the UK than there were in the 1800s. And it's not just a matter of specialization. So it's not the same job made of 10 tasks, which then becomes 2 jobs made of 5 tasks each. These are literally occupations that do not exist in some countries and exist in others. And the very colorful graph, which is kind of a work of art, not my own art, actually code the jobs by ISCO code. The green is agriculture. The countries are ranked in order of GDP. So the poorest countries are on the left, the richest countries are on the right. You see that agriculture disappears, but as it disappears, the shades of color increase. The shades of color there represent different jobs within agriculture. So you see that within each ISCO 1 code, there is, as you move from the left to the right, there are more shades of color. That is, there are more unique jobs for those countries. So this is just to give you a general overview of what we see in the data. And it's this big shift from self-employment to firms. And this facilitates the coordination of people with different skills to work for a common goal. And it is the key difference between rich and poor economies today. So what I will do for the rest of the talk is to give you some evidence from my recent work, both on the transitions between these phases and on the main challenges that people face at different points of this curve. So we will start from the very bottom here, looking at poverty traps in poor rural economies. Then we will compare across the GDP space how the allocation of labor changes with development. And finally, we will go to the so-called first world problems. Now, the big question that we don't have much of an answer to is, how do these transitions happen? How do you go from having 10% of your workforce in wage labor to having 90% in wage labor? We know that they happen very quickly. If you look, for instance, at South Korea, which is a recent example of very fast change, within less than 10 years, the workforce shifted from self-employment to wage labor. Well, one possibility, of course, is that there are multiple equilibria, so that even small changes can have big impacts if you're close to the tipping point, but that's not much consolation if we don't know what these changes are. By policy, could be, and the nature of the problem is different at different stages. So what I'm going to show you now is evidence for individual poverty traps, which is from the subsistence to market. The evidence from markets to firms doesn't exist. There are bits and pieces in the literature that are consistent with there being a poverty trap at the market level, but there is no absolute clear evidence. So let me go from subsistence to market. This is a recent paper that we published with this set of authors, and this is where we go. We go in rural Bangladesh. This is the sample, the yellow areas are the poorer areas of a country which is already pretty poor, or at least was in 2006 when this was started. And we work with BRAC, which is these large NGOs that piloted and then implemented at scale a different approach to poverty reduction. The approach can be summarized as, don't give people fish, teach them how to fish. So instead of giving the standard cash transfers to poor families, what the NGO had in mind and what they implemented was to give a very large transfer, which included a productive activity, livestock, training on how to do that activity, and continuous support, continuous training for 2 years. So we worked with them to evaluate the effect of this program. And these are the different data sets that we collected over the years. So we followed these people for 11 years. That should be 2018. And as you can see, it's quite large scale. We embedded an RCT in the evaluation to measure the effect of the program. In particular, in 50% of randomly selected villages, we implemented the program in 2007. And in the remaining 50%, they implemented it in 2013. So we have 6 years of pure treatment and control households. I'm not going to show you the evaluation. I can just tell you that the program was a great success. It increased income, it increased employment, increased consumption, everything was wonderful. But I think the most interesting thing about this program is that completely by chance, I would wish to be able to say that I planned this, but honestly, it just happened by chance. It gives us a setting in which to test the empirical relevance of poverty traps. Now, let me start with this figure. This is the distribution of productive assets in the 1,400 villages of the sample. The red one is in treatment, the blue one is in control. It doesn't matter which is which because they are the same. Clearly, there are two groups of people. People with productive assets and people without. There is no intermediate case here. Now, these differences can be explained. It'd be surprising how useful the Solo model turns out to be. Can be explained in two ways. One possibility is that we're in a perfectly concave world, the thing on the left, and just some people are less productive than others. So some people have this nice production function where they can afford a steady state of K star, and other people are at zero because they're not able to take care of livestock. Or the alternative is that they're all part of the same process, but the process is S-shaped, so that some people are stuck at zero because they started with no capital. And some people are at K double star because they started with enough capital to grow. Observationally, these two explanations are equivalent. Both yield a group of people that have no capital and a group of people that have. So we cannot distinguish these in the data. They look the same. Unless what happened here is that the program, totally by chance, shifted the treated from the low equilibrium precisely to the point of the distribution where there is less mass. Now, if there is an unstable steady state, which is what you need for poverty traps, so if there is a K star, that's where it's going to be, because by definition, the steady state is unstable, so it has to be where there is the lowest mass. So you see there that the value in the transfer was just enough to bring people in the middle. Had the value of the transfer been enough to bring them to the next steady state, we wouldn't have been able to do anything because you already jumped the tipping point, so you can't identify. But because it's precisely there, what we can do to separate these two views is to see how people respond to the transfer. If the world is the concave world, their long-run equilibrium is at zero. So they will lose the asset, they will sell it, they will consume it. And this is what the vast majority of economists told me when I explained what Graco was trying to do. Say you give a cow to people that have nothing to eat, they will eat the cow. Mm-hmm. That's one possibility. If, however, you're in the poverty trap world, and if you're lucky, you're going to find that people who had a bit of wealth to start with, maybe a couple of chickens, maybe a cart, they will accumulate more assets and move to the top equilibrium, and those who are the poorest will come back. So we can estimate this relationship in the data, right? You can estimate a non-parametric equation with assets after 4 years and assets at baseline. And when you do that, this is what you get. Let me put it here. It looks better like that. So the smooth one is a cubic, and the raggedy one is a non-parametric regression. So you get an S-shaped function with an unstable steady state at 2.34. And true enough, if you look at people who are below that number, they lose assets over time. And people who are above that number, they accumulate more and more assets. Right? So what is special about this program. Why didn't we see this before? We didn't see this before because the vast majority of poverty reduction programs give tiny amounts. They give tiny amounts, people consume the whole amount, we measure poverty by consumption, and we conclude that the programs work, but there is no change in occupation, there is no permanent change in poverty. So these graphs, basically what it does is that we use our estimates to estimate the share of people who would escape the poverty trap at different transfer sizes. And you see that for the vast majority of interventions, that share is very low, just because the transfers are so low. So the first line there, just for reference, is the standard microloan. So the standard microloan that microfinance organizations give will bring up about 20% of people out of the poverty trap. It's just too little. So that is the first poverty trap that we encounter, and it's an individual level poverty trap. Once people escape the poverty trap, they become micro-entrepreneurs. There is about 1 billion micro-entrepreneurs in the world. Do we really, can that be an equilibrium? Well, it is an equilibrium, but why does it exist? Why do firms stay small? This question has been tackled by a very large number of papers, very large number of programs, small programs, cheap interventions, but many cheap interventions add up to an enormous amount of money spent on the problem. And all sorts of explanations have been tried out. Information asymmetry, people want to grow, but they don't know how to do it. Credit constraints, like the previous example, they're still trapped in poverty. Lack of complementary inputs. You want to run a big firm, you need an accountant. There are no accountants. If you look, this is David McKenzie, I forgot to put the citation, David McKenzie's meta-analysis of business training programs. There are many. You don't need to be able to read those numbers. All you need to see is the vertical line is at 0 and all the estimates cross. So there's basically no effect on employment, on sales, or profits. You can do training, you can give capital, you can give workers. We evaluated a training program by BRAC, and we wanted to do a firm training. BRAC wanted to do a firm training. We offered free labor to a group of firms in Uganda, a free labor for a year, paid by BRAC. 24% of them took it. So it doesn't seem to be constrained. Why doesn't it work? Well, everything has been tried. They said maybe the courses are too short, let's try longer courses. Maybe they're too difficult for them. It's triumph of patronizing. Let's try rule of thumb instead of explaining them the principle of accounting. But nothing else. Nothing works. What we might be forgetting is that all of these are treatment on the supply side. They take it for granted that growth is possible and desired by these firms. But maybe not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. Maybe people just want a job. And there is now some evidence that that's indeed the case. There are some interesting experiments where actually economists set up RCTs where they offer people jobs, and they see that all these entrepreneurs quit their entrepreneurial activity and go get a wage job. So one possibility, which I think is gaining more evidence in recently, is that maybe looking at the individual level is not the right thing. Maybe the profitability of a firm depends on the existence of other firms. Maybe these firms don't grow because they don't have anywhere to grow to. They don't have anybody who buys their product. And that's because other firms do not exist. This is the multiple equilibria story of Rosenthal, Rodin, and Hirschman. And that clearly points at looking at the interdependence within firms, which have been completely shut down in RCTs because interdependence in an RCT is an identification threat. It's not something that you want to happen because then you cannot compare treatment and control. But if really what matters is there to be enough firms to be treated, then doing an individual RCT is going to give you no effect. Although if you were to treat many firms at the same time, you might have. Are we there yet? Not with the talk, but with the development. So most people most of the world population lives in middle-income countries. Most middle-income countries have firms and jobs. And yet, the GDP per capita of Ecuador in PPP is $11,000 a year. And the GDP of Norway in PPP is some 70,000. So why do these big differences persist? Let me tell you a story because this has been quite dense. So this data is old, but it's 2015, but if you use the current data, it won't be very different. The Russian. This is Italy. This is where I come from. To be precise, I come from Sicily. And when I was 17, I went to study in Milan. It was always my dream to go to Milan. I managed to get there. And Milan was all shiny. It was very different from Sicily. It was big. There were lots of things. But the one thing that struck me is, with no offense to Northern Italians, if there are any in the audience, was just how kind of stupid people were. Not just everybody, but go to buy bread and the baker doesn't seem so smart as the baker in Syracuse. And the taxi driver doesn't strike you with a brilliant conversation. And then, that was weird for me. So how can this place be so rich when people are not particularly clever? Until I realized that all the clever people were not driving taxis. They were doctors, they were managers. They were teaching in university. Until then, it hadn't occurred to me. I had never seen a correlation between people's, say, ability and the jobs that they did. People did whatever job their parents was doing. That was the allocation in Sicily. And so that's what I want to talk about today, is the allocation of jobs and how that affects growth. So in this paper, we try and measure meritocracy, that is, the assortativeness of matching between jobs and workers. There is a very interesting data set, which one of my co-authors uncovered, is collected by the OECD. You will all be familiar with the PISA scores, which are tests done to teenagers to ascertain the level of knowledge in math and literacy. Now, it turns out that the OECD does the same thing for adults. So you have a measure of skills which is comparable across countries, which is quite amazing because the normal measures, which is schooling, doesn't do a good job simply because the quality of schools in Mexico is very different than the quality of schools in Sweden. Whereas here you have Mexican and Swedish taking exactly the same test. So we have a measure of numeracy and a measure of literacy skills, which is comparable across countries. We also have a measure of job skill requirements because the survey asks people in enormous detail each task that they do at work, and within each task, which skills they use, and we can rank those skills in terms of difficulty. So, for instance, do you use statistical software at work? That would be a high level of numeracy difficulty. Do you use a calculator? That would be a lower level. So what we do is that we develop measures of meritocracy. A simpler one is simply if you rank all the jobs by skill requirement, and you rank all the workers by skills, and you take deciles of this distribution, call it a match if the skills of the worker and the requirements of the job are in the same decile. Right? You can use discrete measures like that, or we use also continuous measures like the Euclidean distance between the skills of the worker and the skill requirement of the job. And what we want to do with this is, well, first see whether indeed there is a correlation between these measures of assortative matching and GDP. That is, whether my intuition when I went to Milan was correct, that Milan was richer not because people were smarter, but because the smarter people were doing the bigger jobs. Okay? And then, as proof that I don't just do RCTs, I go through with people who can do equilibrium frameworks or multidimensional matching, in particular, Ilse Lindenlaub. And this is incredibly fun, because once you estimate a model, then it's like having a Lego set. You can change one thing at a time and see what happens in the economy. And that's what we do. Okay. So first thing first, this is the reduced form analysis. Once we get this measure of meritocracy, matching, we find this is the distance measure. So this is the difference between skills and skill requirements. In an ideal world, this would be 0. You get the best mathematician and you put him in the job that requires most mathematical skills in the country. Okay? So ideally, that number should be 0. In practice, as you can see, it's non-zero. The number varies between 0 and 1.4. So there is quite a bit of variance across countries. And the poorest countries have higher difference, higher distance. So they're less well-matched. Now, how do we go about unpacking this? Well, we start with the idea that there is 3 things that vary across countries. The first is the skills that you inherit. If you assume that the talent is equally distributed across countries, then the quality of schooling differs, and so you end up in the labor market with very different skills. So we take that as given. The second thing is the production technology. That is how you combine labor to produce output. You could use a production technology that exploits the complementarity between people. So we're having 2 people, like a university, having 2 people interested in the same topic is much more likely to give you an answer in that topic than having 2 people working separately. Right? So that is the production technology. And finally, all the bad stuff the poor countries are known for, friction. So you don't get a job as the main doctor in town because you're a good doctor, but you get it because your father was a doctor. So all forms of nepotism, corruption, any individual idiosyncratic frictions that make the match diverge from the optimal one. So these are the 3 ingredients that then determine the allocation of workers to jobs, and then that determines the outcomes. So when we estimate this model, we can do all sorts of counterfactuals. Okay? This is the cross-country output per worker, and this table probably means nothing without seeing the true estimates, but let me give you the bottom line. Frictions. So whether your father was a doctor, whether jobs are allocated on the basis of gender rather than ability, or whether race is discriminated, all those factors matter a lot. They matter a lot in every country. So frictions matter, but they're not what creates the difference across countries. What creates the difference across countries is the incentives to sort, is the returns to a good match. So we find sons of doctors who can be doctors in Norway, but the incentive for somebody who's good at medicine to become a doctor in Norway are much stronger. So we find much more assortative matching in Norway rather than, say, in Mexico. So the most important factor here at explaining cross-country differences is not so much shutting down the individual idiosyncrasies that can create mismatches, but rather it's giving the right incentives for people to solve it. So, in other words, there is always a benefit to hiring your family member. But that benefit doesn't depend on the income of the country. The cost does. If you're in a country where, expansion possibilities are minimal, whether you hire your cousin or the best graduates from the Harvard MBA makes no difference. But if you're in a country where there is a lot of possibilities to grow, then, the Harvard MBA will make a difference, and you will go for that. And this suggests that policies that are designed only to minimize these distortions will be ineffective on their own, which might explain why decades of fights against corruption hasn't eradicated corruption nor has led to much development. Which again is not to say that corruption is a bad thing, but that instead of punishing that, we should focus on rewarding its opposite. Talking about relatives and managers and MBAs brings me to another paper, which looks at CEOs. A while ago, and I don't remember how we got to do this, but we did do this, we collected the diary data of 1,000 CEOs. So for a week, we knew exactly what these 1,000 CEOs did in tranches of 15 minutes. So in these 15 minutes, they had a meeting with the CFO. In these 15 minutes, they continued the meeting with the CFO. Then they went to the bank, and so on. And so this, we call it calendar shadowing. It's like the MBAs do, they follow the CEO, but we follow the diary. We use this machine learning to kind of detect patterns that can separate the CEOs in different styles. And we do that, and we publish the paper. Then the EBRD comes and says, we do this survey every year. We survey 5,000 firms. We would like to know what type of CEOs these firms have. But of course, we cannot follow 5,000 firms for a week every 15 minutes. So we discover, as is often the case, that we can summarize, we can replicate the distinction between those two types of CEOs by asking 5 questions. Of course, we would have never found this out without having collected the 15,000 observations. But these 5 questions are very highly predictive of which type of CEOs you are. Having done that, we added these 5 questions to the EBRD survey. And the point of this exercise was to see whether it was one type of CEO better than the other, or whether it was, again, a problem of matching. Whether one type of CEO existed because some firms need it. Now, what are these types, you might be wondering? They're called leaders and managers. The difference between the two is that the manager, I understand it better, because I think I'd be a manager. The manager is the one that micromanages everything. That goes down on the factory floor, making sure that every machine is working, that even the lowest employee has everything he needs. That's the manager. Okay? The leader is the guy who sits in the corner office, speaks to his COO, who speaks to the guy below, who speaks to the guy below, and eventually somebody will go on the shop floor. Is one type better than the other? Well, the answer that we get is what matters really is whether you get the right type. We can, I won't bore you with the details, but we can predict which type of CEO each firm needs using the previous data set. And then we can run a regression of labor productivity, which is what we do here, on whether you're mismatched, whether you get the wrong CEO, and which way you're mismatched. So you see that the people who get the wrong CEOs, that's where productivity is lost. And these are large numbers. You lose between 9 and 20% of productivity. And as you can imagine, matching is actually better. This is not the clearest graph, but there is a negative relationship between mismatches and GDP. So these two papers point to the importance of getting the right people to do the right jobs. The final two papers that I will review quickly, because also I've lost track of time, are actually on the difficulties that firms face in high-income countries to motivate workers nowadays. Now, motivating workers has always been the main challenge the organization face. So far, we've gotten away with paying people, paying them for performance, paying them more and more. The assumption is that efforts can be bought, but efforts can be bought up to a point. And in particular, as firms grow, each person, each worker becomes such a small part of the total that identifying the individual contribution becomes more and more difficult. So it's very hard to target incentives to the worker. And the second point is that it's more than just effort. So you can compensate people to do something that they don't like, but only up to a point, as we will see. If you don't mind, for my own time management, I need to see what time it is. The minutes? My watch ran out of battery. It's really not a good idea to have watch the hands out of bed. Okay. So, these two are two recent field experiments. So we come back home after having estimated structural models of the macroeconomy. There are two field experiments with, I can come back to once, with two large multinationals. One in the financial sector, one is a large bank, and the other one is a manufacturing multinational. They are as wacky as they get. So the first one is a purpose workshop, and the second one is volunteer days. Now, let me start with Marx. Why do I start with Marx? Because actually, unbeknown to them, the HR, the CHRO, so the Chief Executive Office for Personnel in these firms, basically has targeted these two problems. One, and this is what the purpose workshop targets, is the fact that you're not yourself at work. And that's why you need to be compensated. And the other one is simply the fact that you don't relate to your coworkers. Now, how do these experiments link to this problem? Let me start with volunteering. That's in the bank. Banks don't have the greatest reputation for social purpose, right? And this reflects negatively on the culture inside the banks because everybody's trying to maximize their own utility at the expense of others, and it's not a nice environment, to put it mildly. And so in banks, HR managers face this problem. The main problem that they face is turnover. It costs a lot to start a new employee. These are qualified employees. It costs quite a lot, and the separation rate is extremely high. So the main problem is to understand why people don't like to work for the bank and how they can make work more pleasant. And so they came up with this idea, which they gave people 2 free days a year of volunteering. So you can take the day off as long as you go volunteering somewhere. You don't even have to prove that you've been volunteering. Now, 2 days a year might seem pathetic. It is 10% of their leave. So their leave days increase by 10% with 2 days. So I'll let you figure out how many leave days they have and how lucky we all are. And the idea there is that by getting office workers to do something else, something with a social purpose, they would change the view of their co-workers. They would find out more about their co-workers, and they would find, hopefully, something good about them, and that would improve the atmosphere at work. I'll let you know in a second what. The second one is the purpose workshop. The purpose workshop is esoteric, to say the least. So this is done in the multinational, the manufacturing multinational. And the reason why we started studying these things, despite my high level of skepticism, is that all organizations are investing millions in these programs. And the reason they're investing millions is that the level of engagement of the workforce is plummeting, especially after the coronavirus. Most people don't even show up at work, and those who show up at work do very little. So, purpose workshop. It's very difficult for us academics to understand what it means to go and be paid for something that you don't want to do. And sometimes I think about, what if my job were only grading exams? How much would you have to pay me? I would stay home probably. So what the purpose workshop does is that it makes every job a bit like research for us. So it makes you think, no, I've done purpose workshop because I cannot talk about something that I don't know what it is. So when I do experiments in Bangladesh, I go to Bangladesh to try and understand how things are. When I do experiments with a firm that does purpose workshops, I actually did the purpose workshop, 2 days of my life. I understand why it works. It works in making you think what you really like, what you enjoy doing. And then the idea is, if you can see that in your work, look at it. If you cannot see that in your work, you should change jobs. And indeed, one of the main effects, anticipate the results of this workshop, is a lot of people quit. And I'll show you who did. Not necessarily a bad thing. So this, to me, is one of the most interesting graphs I've seen in recent times. I say this on my own work, which is great. What is this? We collect a psychological measure of meaning. That is, how much meaning does the job have for you? Right? So there are questions about, my work is very interesting. I am, in the morning, I'm very curious to see what the day brings at work. I like to solve problems. I like to help people. It's all questions that measure how much you like your job. Pay is pay. There is a really nice trade-off there. And so you see that in the firm, there are a lot of people that are paid a lot of money to do something that they detest doing. There is a trade-off. And after the treatment, this is what happens. There's no more trade-off. And that change is largely due to the people that were earning a lot and were staying in the job because they were earning a lot, yet hating what they were doing, they quit. No? So the low performers leave the firm. And these were low performers which were paid a lot, so they end up saving a big bit. Some people change jobs within the firm. So some people who were in finance moved to EDI. But also the other way around. People who were in HR moved to finance because they like spreadsheets. That's the beauty about work, about labor, that everybody's different. We have different skills and different preferences. It makes sense to match to jobs that require those skills and preferences. And we have also an increase in performance in the same job. Now, that's what happened with the purpose workshop. What happened with the volunteer bankers? This is a big bank. The cool thing, so that online, I told you about the volunteering, 2 days, we randomized the invitation to join this scheme. Now, because this is really a social treatment, the randomization, this is a nightmare, the randomization is done to be able to identify peer effects at different levels. Okay, so we first randomize offices in treatment and control, then we randomize teams within offices, and eventually individuals within teams. So you can compare the individual randomization to the team, to the office. It turns out that there are strong peer effects at the office level. So in aggregate, we see that in offices where more people are treated, more people uptake, performance increases, the values increase, and everything is wonderful. But there is one interesting glitch, which is that 2 days of work are fantastic when you have 20 days leave and you only work when you're at work. But if your job is to finish a task, no matter how long it takes you, giving you 2 days of work is a nightmare. And giving 2 days of work to the people who are supposed to help you finish that task is even more of a nightmare. So this policy improves the productivity of the people at the bottom of the skill and pay distribution. So the technical support, the admin support, they're all happy. But it doesn't make managers better off. Many managers quit. And in offices where the manager doesn't volunteer, performance actually goes down. So it works up to a point. It works in changing culture when it doesn't clash with existing incentive structure. When it clashes with the incentive structure, the workers who were happily volunteering and see their manager not volunteering and actually being upset about the whole thing, they become less productive, more disillusioned, and less productive. So, what have we learned from this very quick overview of papers about laborers from rural Bangladesh to managers, bank managers in London? I think what I conclude from all of this is two things. The first is that everybody needs a job. And ultimately, the welfare of people depends on the job that they do. Now, the welfare of the nation depends on this aggregation of people. But we normally see in economics, we always look at the individual. We sum up all the individuals, and that should give us the welfare of the nation. But it's not the case. If we look at any unit, from firms to football teams to countries as a whole, you can see whether the aggregate productivity is equal to the sum of the individual productivities, and it's never the case. So there's something else that gets lost in the aggregation. And there's something else. When we run experiments, we always think about it as something that we have to shut down because it's contamination, it's spillovers. We cannot compare treatment and control. But that's what we really don't know much about, is the group dynamics, is the interdependence between people, and what makes the total be much more than the sum of the parts. So that's what I think, if you're interested in research in economics, I suggest that you look at. And I'm